All right, so let's get into our first lesson. Systems, cycles, and spectrums. The objective of this class, and this is going to go relatively short. This is just kind of like a precursor, like laying the most basic foundation of political organization. So for this first lesson, we're going to examine patterns and cycles that occur naturally in society. We're going to be looking at different political systems. You'll learn the difference between a unitary system, a confederation, a federation, that kind of thing. We're going to talk about the political spectrum and the political compass, one of which I use, the other I do not. We'll talk about the dynastic cycle. That's something we get from China. Then we'll talk about the Tytler cycle, and we'll talk about the Pareto distribution. Okay, so let's start off with the unitary system. If you want to write down anything, I would recommend you just draw out the chart or image. A unitary system is a top-down power distribution, which means all power resides in the central authority and then is delegated downwards to meet the necessary demands of government. New York State operates as a unitary system. All power in the state of New York is focused in Albany. And then Albany delegates their power to the counties and finally to the cities. This is why Governor Cuomo and Mayor de Blasio can't stand each other, because de Blasio wants more power and Cuomo won't give it to him. Some of you are laughing. You're like, yup. It's one of the reasons the subways are never on time. There are some benefits to unitary systems. A unitary system is also the oldest form of government in human civilization, and that's globally. The first civilizations to ever form in India, in China, in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, along the Danube River, in central Mexico, all of them, they were all unitary systems. They fell under the control of a monarchy. And the monarchs, the kings or the queens, held total power over society, but one king or one queen cannot micromanage the entire country. So what they did is they delegated power to lower authorities until local governance was established. There are some benefits to a unitary system. A unitary system, because all of the power resides within the top of the government, or in many cases, one person. A country or a society that operates under a unitary system can adjust to rapid changes very quickly, which means they can address a crisis very quickly. And that's because the central authority can overrule lower authorities, and the central authority can withdraw its power from lower authorities, just like that. So for example, let's talk about New York. Let's say that Albany empowers a county to, I don't know, get an infrastructure job done, and the county completely bungles it, and they start stealing money. Albany can step in and remove everybody on that project and give the responsibility to somebody else. We frequently see unitary systems in the form of monarchies, dictatorships, and in parliaments. Some examples of modern unitary systems, aside from New York and every other state in the Union, China, Cuba, the United Kingdom, and France are all unitary systems. I believe Canada is also a unitary system. All of the power comes out of the Canadian government. But like in the UK, all power resides within Parliament in London. Okay. The next system of government we're going to talk about is a confederation. A confederation is the exact opposite of a unitary system. If a unitary system is top-down, a confederation is bottom-up. It's a bottom-up power distribution. All power resides with the local authorities and is delegated upwards to meet the demands of governance. So in theory, if New York operated as a confederation system, all of the power would be in New York City and all of the other towns. And then, let's say they needed to regulate interstate trade, and each city couldn't do it by establishing their own trade networks, they would implement a county system and give the county the ability to regulate trade within the state. And let's say the counties then couldn't handle trade between states. They would then create a state government to handle trade on that level. That's how it operates in theory. Lower authorities can easily overrule upper authorities and reclaim their individual power. There are some benefits to a confederation system, but not a whole lot. The main benefit of the confederation system is usually they are extremely liberty friendly, because all of the power is derived from the locals or from the local authorities. So you as an individual citizen have a ridiculous amount of influence on local politics and the direction of your society in a confederation. But that is also a big detractor as well, because if you put 3 people in a room, you're going to get 6 opinions. Confederations are generally very unstable. Most historical examples of confederations failed quickly and miserably. 2 examples are here in the United States. We've tried it twice. Immediately after independence, the United States formed a confederation under, some of you may recall, the Articles of Confederation. And that failed in 1789 and was replaced by the Constitution because the Confederation fell apart. During the Civil War, the Confederate States of America tried to form a confederation. One of the primary reasons why they lost the war, because Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederate States of America, did not have nearly the same amount of power that Abraham Lincoln had. And Abraham Lincoln was able to field an enormous army, supply it, and put them in the battlefield while the Confederates could not. An example being in the operations of the Confederate system with the Confederate States of America. How many of you have ever seen photos of the Confederate Army? You ever notice the quality of their clothing? Anybody? Usually when you look up pictures of the Confederate Army, they're wearing rags or uniforms of different colors. Can anybody guess why? That's one of the big things. Yeah, they had no money.
They didn't want to be known, like recognized, maybe.
Well, I mean, you're trying to fight in a pitched battles in uniform. You definitely want to be recognized so you don't get shot by your own people.
Yeah, but like.
Because that would kind of suck,
They were individuals. They had to be able to take whatever they wanted to wear.
North Carolina had the largest textile factory in the country when the Civil War broke out. But the governor of North Carolina refused to supply uniforms to any soldier that did not come from North Carolina. So if you ever see photos at the very end of the war, let's say 1865, most of the Confederate troops are wearing rags. But occasionally you'll see a Confederate soldier in a uniform that looks pristine, brand new. Chances are that soldier came from North Carolina. And it was a big sticking point because Jefferson Davis was trying to get the governor of North Carolina to supply uniforms for the entirety of the army. North Carolina's like, nope, North Carolina supplies for North Carolina men. And that's it. How do you fight a war like that? You can't. Because if you're arguing over uniforms, you're probably arguing over ammunition, firearms, food, transportation, all kinds of things. So it's a fat mess. There is a confederation or confederacy that has lasted a very long time, the Iroquois Confederacy. No one really knows for certain when the Iroquois Confederacy formed. We have a pretty good idea. It was sometime in the 1600s, but we can't pinpoint an exact date. And the reason being is the Constitution of the Iroquois Confederacy is an oral constitution, which means it was an agreed upon verbal contract, which was written down later. It's called the Peace of the Long Leaves, I believe, or Peace of the Long Tree, something meta like that. But the Iroquois Confederacy is, by the way, the oldest constitution in the Americas. It predated European settlement. And they're still around, although the Iroquois Confederacy doesn't really have a country. And they have a very small population. The European Union is also a confederacy, and for those of you who pay attention to international politics, the European Union is quite unstable at the moment. Mostly because it's a confederacy. In comes the American system, a federation system, also known as a federal system. It's why we call the central government the federal government. It's not a top-down distribution, it's not a bottom-up distribution, it's a power-sharing system. All power is divided and shared equally between all levels of authority. Federal systems are internally very stable, but they're also slow. It's no surprise it took the United States a couple of years before they finally got involved in both world wars. It's no surprise the United States was among the last countries in the Western world to grant voting rights to women. because the process of making changes in a federal system is slow and arduous. It's a very difficult process because you have to make sure that all parties involved are satisfied. The benefit of a federal system is that power is not easily transferred from one level to another, and it cannot be taken. President Trump cannot come out tomorrow and say, I am taking this responsibility away from the House of Representatives. Can't do it, because the House of Representatives, all they have to say is, ha ha, no. But power can be freely given. And it's something that has happened in the past. Like, for example, during the Vietnam War in 1965, when President Lyndon Johnson wanted to put troops in the South Vietnam. In theory, or technically, Johnson would have had to require the United States Congress to declare war against either North Vietnam or the Viet Cong, for example, but they didn't do it. What they did, however, is they temporarily gave the president a blank check on military power, and the president was then able to send troops into Vietnam and drag us into a war that was never fully declared. Congress later took that power back, because it was their power to begin with. But there have been several instances in American history where one branch of government or the other has willingly given up some of its power to another branch. Usually it's temporary. Sometimes it's permanent. Like, for example, the President of the United States is far more powerful today than the office was 50 years ago. And the power of the presidency has grown through both political parties. Clinton expanded the power of the presidency, Bush W. expanded the power of the presidency, Obama expanded the power of the presidency, and Trump is trying to expand the power of the presidency. Everybody does it. Some of you are like, what? Yeah, it's kind of mind-boggling when we talk about the power of the presidency. I'm assuming you guys all kind of liked Barack Obama, right? Yeah, he's a likable guy. I didn't vote for him, but he's a likable guy. When Congress willingly gave some of their responsibility to President Obama, nobody really cared because he was a likable guy. But when you empower the office of the presidency, you're not empowering the person that holds the office. You're empowering the person that holds the office, or you're empowering the office itself. So the power that was given to Obama was by default also given to Trump. Why do you think Trump is able to hold so much leverage over the DACA issue? Immigration policy is supposed to be set by Congress. But because Congress couldn't figure out what to do with who fell under DACA, President Obama had to make the determination. And Congress turned a blind eye as Obama said, I am taking this on as an executive decision, even though it's technically Congress's responsibility. So Obama took on the power in order to deal with DACA, but now Trump's got it. And he's using it to like hang over Congress's head like, hey man, you gave me this power. Some of you are like, yeah, remember that next time you vote, right? Okay, federal systems generally take shape in the form of a constitutional republic. Some modern examples of it: the United States is a federal system. Same thing with Russia, Germany, Brazil, and Mexico. Mexico's a federal system. They have states just like we do. As for the American federal system, this is the shape that it takes. Illuminati confirmed. The president is, in theory, a representative of the federal government because he's the executive. The Senate is supposed to be the representative of the state governments, and then the House of Representatives represents the local governments, which, by the way, also explains their term limits. Does anybody know how long the presidential term is? 4 years. What about the Senate? 6 years. What about the House of Representatives? 2 years. All 435 members of the House of Representatives are elected every 2 years. The reason being is because the House of Representatives is supposed to be the voice of the localities, the voice of the people. Public opinion changes all the time. So that's why we're supposed to elect our representatives every 2 years, because the representatives are supposed to be rotated frequently in order to best represent what the people want. But the founders also wanted to include the Senate in this, and they gave the senators 6-year terms, because if you have your government changing directions every 2 years, it's very chaotic. So the Senate is supposed to be the stabilizing element of our government. And that's why they have 6-year terms. The Senate is supposed to be the old, crusty, boring chamber of Congress. It's the House of Representatives that's supposed to be the riot/party all wrapped into one. See, I would actually like to be in the House of Representatives. That'd be cool. The Senate's would probably put everybody to sleep. And then the president is supposed to be the balancing act between the two. Any questions about that? Does it make sense? Okay. How many of you have heard the difference between have heard left wing or right wing? It gets thrown around a lot in modern politics. Okay. Does anybody know where that came from?
Airplanes.
Yeah. I always sit on the left airplane wing. This is a political spectrum. It's outdated, but this is where we get the term left wing, right wing. It's to identify political alignments, really. It's really a legacy of something that happened in France in 1789 called the Estates General. We'll talk about this, I think, in week 3 or 4, hopefully week 3. When France was going through its revolution, the king called for a meeting of a whole bunch of people from different walks of life in France. And the king sat in the middle of the conference room, I guess you would call it. And to his right were all the old aristocracy and the nobility, the ones that supported the king. And to the king's left hand were the commoners, the ones that wanted more radical change. And that's where we get left wing, right wing. Because the right has a tendency to be more traditional, more conservative, and the left has a tendency to be more radical and pushing for more change. See? Happened 200 years ago, still affects us. It is an outdated model because it's too simple to explain nuance in politics. Like libertarians, for example, they're over here on social issues. They don't care about gay marriage, they don't care about drug legalization, in fact they support both. But fiscal issues, they're over here. They don't like being taxed. So, how do you identify that? It's like a libertarian would be called an extreme right-winger by a Democrat, and an extreme left-winger by a Republican. The libertarians are going, how about neither? Right? So for example, was Hitler left-wing or right-wing? Left? In some ways he was. In others, he was right. Right-wing, sorry. Hitler existed on both extremes of the political spectrum. You're like, what? Yeah, he existed over here in economics because he was a socialist. But in terms of racial purity, he was over here, on the extreme right. Because the further left you go, people don't care about race. The further right you go, suddenly race becomes a big issue. So Hitler was on both extremes. So you can't really label him as left or right wing. So I rest my case. This is why we have turned to this, the political compass. I know you've taken your political compass quiz, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. The political compass quiz is far more accurate than the political spectrum because instead of 2 extremes, you've actually got 4 quadrants. And it's better equipped to explain political nuance. And if you just do a Google search of political compass, you can take like a quick 2-minute, 3-minute quiz and try to figure out actually where you align. It's really cool. I think it does lack a 3rd dimension, which is social outlook, like the z-axis, but I mean, I don't make the thing. I will usually use this model to describe governments that we examine throughout the course. So like Adolf Hitler is up here, authoritarian right, and, Hitler is authoritarian left, and Stalin is also authoritarian left. That's why I say it lacks a z-axis, because Hitler would be here and Stalin would be back here. That's what I mean by z-axis, but we'll talk about that later. Libertarian right is kind of where the United States sits. Although we kind of waffle a little bit between we kind of waffle around the center, kind of, between these 3 quadrants. We'll occasionally be authoritarian left, a little bit authoritarian right, and libertarian right, but we usually don't stray too far from the center. I don't know of any society that falls into libertarian left. That doesn't really make a lot of sense to me, but it's there. Okay, next cycle we're going to talk about is this. This is the legacy from China. How many of you remember anything from Chinese history when you were in high school? Some of you are like, what?
It's been a while.
The dynastic cycle. Has anybody ever seen this before?
No.
Really? My heart is broken. In order to understand the dynastic cycle, we have to talk a little bit about Chinese ancient history. Chinese society developed in isolation. It's why it's so unique compared to the rest of the world. The first settlements of the first civilizations that formed were on the Nile River in Egypt, the Tigris and Euphrates River in Mesopotamia, the Danube River in what is now like Hungary, Austria, Germany, that area, central Mexico, and the Indus River in India, and then the Yellow River and the Yangtze and the Huanghe River in China. Mesopotamia, Danube River civilizations, and Egyptian civilization were all connected by one gigantic landmass. So they did kind of interact with each other, especially as their civilizations grew and expanded. But China was separated from the rest of the world by a desert and by a mountain range. So they really didn't get a chance to interact much with their Indian neighbors, even though the Indians were able to kind of interact with the Mesopotamians. It's actually really, really cool. So that's why Chinese culture is so unique compared to everything else that's in the world. And the religion of the Chinese before Buddhism got into China is based around ancestor worship. They do believe in gods, but they also believed that the spirits of the dead would live on to shape modern society. That's why you'll occasionally see more traditional Chinese people pray to the ancestors. How many of you seen Mulan? There you go. The ancestors, right? So the Chinese believe that the souls of those who have died can still impact daily life. The Chinese believe that the spirits of the dead remain to watch over us, shape world events, that kind of thing. So stable ruling families or dynasties are seen as having the approval of the ancestors, what the Chinese called the mandate of heaven. That they've gotten like the seal of approval from the ancestors. The ancestors have kind of checked off on this government, like this government's legit, we support them. And then it's demonstrated by good harvests, good weather, internal stability, that kind of thing, good governance. But when the dynasty starts to falter, like every ruling class or every ruling family does, the ancestors would then inflict chaos in order to demonstrate their displeasure. So corruption seeps in. All right, we got here. Mandate of heaven. People believe the new dynasty has the God's approval. Then you move to the second point. The dynasty's power begins to grow weaker. Then China would be devastated by disasters like floods, famines, invasions, civil wars. It was this stage where the people would see that as a sign from heaven that their government has lost legitimacy in the eyes of the ancestors. It's essentially the ancestors saying, hey, here's a flood, here's a big fire, here's a famine, and this is us telling you, get rid of your government because they suck. So it's a sign for the people to work to topple their current dynasty. The people would then believe the dynasty has lost the God's approval, and they rebel. The dynasty is overthrown, and a new dynasty is put in place in order to restore order, and you go back to the beginning of the cycle again. That dynasty rules with the God's approval. This, by the way, this dynastic cycle was invented by the second Chinese dynasty, known as the Zhao, because they overthrew the first dynasty. So, hey, let's overthrow the government. Okay, how do we make it look legitimate? We say the God's dead. Essentially in Chinese culture, rebellion is technically illegal. I don't know of any government that actually says, yeah, you can totally rebel whenever you want. Because people in power usually like to stay alive. The right of rebellion is illegal in China, but it is considered socially acceptable. That's why the Chinese call it the right of rebellion. Okay, the next cycle that we're going to look at, this is a Chinese cycle. We're going to look at a cycle invented by a Westerner called the Tytler cycle. Have any of you ever seen this? Okay. Tytler cycle. This is probably more pertinent to us because this whole thing was shaped by the study of how Athenian democracy collapsed. The Tytler cycle is the brainchild of a political theorist from Scotland named Alexander Fraser Tytler. He lived from 1747 to 1813. He was a professor of Greek and Roman antiquities. So he studied Greek society, or ancient Greek and ancient Roman societies. And he discovered a cycle within Athens, pretty much, by studying how Athens operated. And he developed this to kind of map the decline and fall of Athenian democracy. Why did Athenian democracy fail, right? We all consider democracy to be like the pinnacle of excellence, really. Democracy is the best. I mean, George W. Bush, we're going to spread democracy, right? Every president talks about how wonderful democracy is. Well, Tytler thought democracy was a mess. So he used this to map the decline and fall of Athenian democracy, essentially outlining that democracies always become corrupted and then fail due to that corruption. So his quote in describing Athens, he goes, quote, "The upper classes were perpetually divided into factions and under the banners of the contending demagogues, who maintained their influence over their partisans by the most shameful corruption and bribery, by the plunder of the public money." That was in his book, Universal History. So what does that mean? Well, think about how a democracy works. People vote for people to hold power, right? How do you get power? How do you convince someone to vote for you and to support you in gaining power?
Tell them things that they want to hear.
Yeah, tell them things that you want to hear. Is that always to the benefit of society? No. Sometimes it can be. Athens did occasionally elect people that were really good at their jobs. But most of the time they elected a bunch of idiots. So, how would these people get power and then maintain it? By, as Wakaya said, telling people what they want to hear. It's like, I'm going to, vote for me and I'll support you in whatever you want. Vote for me and I'll give you this much. Vote for me and I'll support this program. That kind of thing. It's reflective in American politics too. How many politicians get out and promise stuff? Universal health care, free education, free child care, free transportation. How are they going to pay for it? They're going to go out to their money tree and start picking $100 bills off the branches? No, where do they get the money from?
Tax.
Taxpayers. And that's what the Athenian demagogues used to do. That's what Tytler said, by the plunder of the public money. Essentially, the people in Athens that wanted power would go up to enough voters, because in Athens all you needed was 50% plus one vote in order to win the election. And these demagogues would come up and gather enough people, say, if you vote for me, I will give you this, and make the other guys pay for it. Some of you are like, what? Kind of connecting to modern society, right? All right, so in comes the Tytler cycle. The Tytler cycle starts up here, at what Tytler called bondage. Now, bondage is not physical, not always physical bondage, although you can apply it to be so, as in people actually in slavery and in chains. But it starts with this, bondage. People are enslaved somehow, whether it be mentally, whether it be emotionally, whether they've become so dependent on another group of people that they have lost all form of autonomy. A good example actually happened in New York during the 1800s. How many of you know anything about the machine politics? You probably learned about it in history as Tammany Hall and Boss Tweed. That ring any bells? No? Okay. The New York City Democratic Party ran out of a place called Tammany Hall under the era of the political machines and the Gilded Age. And essentially, the Republicans did this too, but New York was run by Tammany Hall. So Republicans had to do it in other locations. What Tammany Hall did is they would set up welcoming committees in like Ellis Island, when all of these immigrants were coming in, applying for citizenship, and then trying to integrate in the United States. And representatives of the Democratic Party would meet with the new immigrants, talk to them, get to know them, and then set them up with jobs and apartments. And the only thing that was required was that every election season, these immigrants had to go vote for Democratic candidates. So, during election cycles, representatives of the Democratic Party would go around to all of the apartments that they own, knock on the door, and say, it's election, you need to come vote for this guy, and this guy. And if the immigrant's like, I looked at the issues and I don't think I could support your candidate, then the party would respond by saying, well, I'm afraid I can't keep you in our apartment. Yeah, right? So the people that were beholden to these political parties were stuck there. Vote for this candidate or lose your house. Vote for this candidate or lose your job. That's not independence. Independence is the ability to vote for whoever you want for whatever reason, right? So that's what we mean by bondage. But people can only handle this so long. The natural desire of humanity is to be independent. We don't like being enslaved. Like, think about this. How many times you wanted to go out with your friends and your parents said no, and you flipped out? Why? You can't tell me what to do, right? Because we like being independent. So, bondage eventually turns into spiritual faith. And this is how Tytler described it, but it's not necessarily religious. Spiritual faith can take multiple forms. One, and most prominent, is belief in God or some other type of organized religion. Like, for example, in American history, African-American slaves turned to Christianity as a way to empower themselves to try to resist against their state of bondage. In the Caribbean, they turned to voodoo. They turned to a type of religion in order to gain empowerment, in order to try to fight against their bondage. But spiritual faith eventually turns into courage. Courage, actually the courage to act. Whether you rebel, whether you actually kill your overseer in the event, or in the case of Nat Turner's rebellion. Nat Turner took his faith in God, killed his overseer, and tried to start a slave uprising in Virginia. And it almost succeeded. Same thing happened in Haiti. That one did succeed. Courage will eventually turn into liberty. And once you gain liberty, then the sky's the limit. People, when they are free to pursue their own goals and to pursue their own happiness, have a tendency to find success, which then liberty goes into abundance. Because when a lot of people are finding a lot of success, you have a lot of abundance. Think about the United States immediately after World War II. World War II, we were here, liberty, we had liberated Western Europe from under the Nazi jackboot, we had liberated Asia from under the rule of Imperial Japanese, and we were the last major economy standing in the world. We produced everything. And what did we turn to? Consumerism. The accumulation of physical wealth. Everybody wanted a house, a car, a dog, white picket fence, leave it to Beaver. And if that meant that we had to deny other people living in the United States the right to pursue their happiness, well, you know what, so be it. And that was in the form of Jim Crow laws, for example. Even though Jim Crow laws were put in place long before World War II. But it still manifested in that. So, liberty turns to abundance, and abundance turns into selfishness. This is human behavior. Selfishness then turns into complacency. Complacency turns into apathy. People stop caring. Apathy then returns to dependency. Why should I care, or why should I worry about providing for my own health insurance when somebody else will do it for me?
What is
Complacency is where you recognize something is happening and you know it's wrong, but you're like, I can't really do anything about it. Apathy is, I don't even care. Complacency is, yeah, it's wrong and I think it's wrong, but what can I do? I'm just one person. Apathy is, yeah, I know what's happening. Who cares? Apathy turns into dependency, and the dependency eventually turns back into bondage. And the cycle repeats itself. Now it's weird. You can apply this to countries. You can also apply this to individual groups within specific countries. So like, for example, America immediately after the Civil War, African Americans were here trying to jump from the liberty to the abundance section, whereas Southern white society were somewhere around here. Selfishness, complacency, and in some cases apathy. Different parts of the world are in different areas. I actually look at the Middle East and see the Islamic world somewhere around here, between spiritual faith, courage, and liberty, depending on what country it is. And I think the United States is somewhere along here. Complacency, apathy, and dependency. Actually, the entire West is somewhere around here. All right, the last thing we're going to talk about is a Pareto distribution. How many of you have ever heard this? We're getting into a little bit of economics now. How many of you have ever taken an econ class? Good, you saved yourself a lot of trouble. All right, Pareto distribution is the brainchild of an Italian, Vilfredo Pareto, who lived in Italy from 1848 to 1923. It's also called the 80-20 law. This particular graph represents the Pareto distribution in terms of income in the United States. In economics, it's called the Lorenz curve. I'll talk about that in just a second. Actually, I'll talk about that now. The Lorenz curve highlights the income gap between the ultra-wealthy and the ultra-poor, and the distribution of wealth. In theory, if you were to take all of the income or all of the wealth of a country and divide it by the population, it should be equally divided, correct? To where the bottom 20 of society has 20% of the wealth. And then the next 20% of the population has another 20% of the wealth. And then on and on and on and on. Creates a line like this, to where when you finally get 100% of the population, you've got a distribution of 100% of the wealth, right? This is what people think that distribution of wealth, power, land, that kind of thing is supposed to look like. This is the baseline. In reality, the distribution of wealth has a tendency to look like this, where the bottom 20% of a population has maybe 8% of the wealth. And the top 20% of the population has 70% of the wealth. Right? See how that works? Now, Vilfredo Pareto was trying to study the distribution of land and income in Italy, and that's how we get the concept of the Pareto distribution. And he came to the conclusion that no matter what Italian society has tried, land and wealth always has a tendency to concentrate into the hands of a super elite group of society. And what the Pareto distribution does is it pretty much highlights the natural tendency for wealth, power, property, prestige in order to accumulate into the hands of a social elite. It's a distribution hierarchy. You may have heard the phrase, wealth begets wealth. There is a book out about like how to become a millionaire, and the main lesson is the first million is the hardest. Once you make your first $1 million, your next $1 million is a hell of a lot easier to make. Because if you've demonstrated to your neighbors that you can make $1 million, people are going to trust you with their money. Make sense? Wealth begets wealth, power begets power. How many of you watch Game of Thrones? I think it was like in season 2 when like Littlefinger was getting all of these titles, and he made that comment. He was like, titles do seem to get more titles. Because he got one title, next thing he got 50 castles. He's like, wow, that was fast. Pareto distribution. So a couple of examples, these are goofy, but I mean, why is it that Tom Cruise is basically in every movie ever made, ever? He's not that good an actor. He's kind of short, he's kind of goofy. But he's in every movie ever made. Because producers know what he brings to the table, and he's got star power. For some reason, people like going to see Tom Cruise movies. I mean, my God, he played a samurai. He's a white dude playing a samurai. That's like when John Wayne was cast to play Genghis Khan. It doesn't work. Right? So this is the thing with the Pareto distribution. So why do these work the way they work? Pareto distributions are phenomenons that society has been trying to address for centuries. No one knows why they happen. It's observable, which is why we call it a Pareto distribution, because Pareto was the one that figured it out in the first place. But we don't know why they happen, and we don't know how to fix them. Think about this. The United States, for example, the war on poverty. Does anybody know how much money the federal government has spent on the war on poverty? Trillions. Trillions of dollars have been spent on the war on poverty. Do you know how much the poverty rate in the United States has changed? A fraction of a percent. When Lyndon Johnson started the war on poverty in 1964, the poverty rate was barely higher than our current poverty rate. Yet the government has spent trillions of dollars and it cannot seem to address the poverty rate.
Should have just gave us more.
Would have been easier to just cut people checks. You're right. Would have been easier, but it probably still wouldn't have fixed the issue. Because the people that were in poverty would have come out of poverty and another group of people would have gone in. There is this weird thing that happens in capitalist society. It's economic mobility. People fall in and out of poverty just as frequently as they fall in and out of wealth. It is really, really hard to stay super wealthy, just like it is really, really hard statistically to stay in poverty, but it does happen. Okay, so what sociologists kind of come to the conclusion about why this works the way it does is Human nature, really. Some people just naturally exhibit either more tenacity, more cunning, more ruthlessness, or more physical ability than others. I mean, I want to be a quarterback for the 49ers. I'm too short, I'm too fat, I'm too slow, and I don't have the arm strength. So why can't I be a quarterback for the 49ers? Because I can't do the job. It's part of what makes us human, to be honest with you, and that's why things kind of work out the way it does. Some people are just luckier than others. And it sucks, but it's one of those natural phenomena that really there's no answer to. Superman isn't real. Nobody has developed a solution to unequal distribution of wealth and power, although many societies have tried, though often to disastrous results, which we will be talking about in the future weeks. For example, the Soviet Union, when Russia fell under the control of the communists, they tried to address the wealth and the income inequality by killing the top 10% of their population. They just killed all the rich people, took their shit, and distributed it to the commoners. What happened? Within a generation, they had another class of ultra-wealthy, but they were all party members.
They made sure they was party members, so they won't die.
Exactly. Think about what's happening in Venezuela. People in Venezuela had to break into the zoo to kill the zoo animals to get enough food to survive, whereas Nicolas Maduro has a net worth somewhere around $4 billion. And all of his cronies are multimillionaires. Their people starve while everybody in the Venezuelan government lives high. Hugo Chavez's daughter is one of the wealthiest people in Venezuela. I don't think she lives there anymore. And Hugo Chavez was the one that took power in order to address the income inequality. So how did he accumulate so much wealth? Right? Some of you were like, oh, damn, good point. All right. Let's get into the meat and potatoes of today's lesson. The New World emerges. Does anybody have any questions about what we talked about so far? No? You all good? Okay, cool. So, the main question that this lesson is going to address, how did European nations begin to emerge as world players? That's a tough question, especially if you have any basic understanding of what Europe was like in the Middle Ages. It was a hot mess. So how did this continent that was plunged into chaos, what historians refer to as the Dark Ages, how did they go from being this chaotic, violent little corner of the world to global conquerors? Kind of crazy how it happened. And it happened very quickly. So, what this lesson is going to do is we're going to outline the state of the world in 1450, and we're going to explore the emergence of modern Europe during the Renaissance, and then examine dynastic and religious struggles that shaped European politics and society, which thus, in turn, encouraged international interaction. So first and foremost, we'll start with China. This is a map of the Ming Dynasty and the trade routes that they controlled. China, just a few hundred years before this class begins, was the wealthiest and most powerful country in the world without question. Phenomenally wealthy. So the Ming Dynasty, which was in power from 1368 to 1644, was still in its golden age, although it was in the waning years of its golden age by 1450. The dynasty itself rose after the Mongol Empire collapsed, and they developed to be a bit more isolationist than previous Chinese dynasties, but this was not always the case. When the Ming Dynasty first emerged, the first emperor is the one that ordered the organization of these trade routes, which the Chinese did maintain. But by 1450, China was being pressured by nomadic invasions from the north. There was one crisis that happened in 1449, actually, the Tumu crisis of 1449. The eighth dynasty, or the eighth emperor, was captured and forced to abdicate the throne by a tribe of Mongols. So the Mongols encroached upon China's northern border. The emperor put together an army to fight the Mongols off. The emperor's army was defeated, the emperor himself was captured, and the Mongols are like, you either give up your throne or you give up your life. And the emperor was like, I was thinking about retiring anyway. The new emperor of China and his successors adopted a siege mentality. To them, they're like, We've got nomadic groups that are coming in from the north. Our borders are unsecure. We have to defend ourselves. And that caused them to kind of close off China to much of the world. Construction of the Great Wall then was accelerated. Now, the common misconception about the Great Wall was that it was built by one government or one dynasty in one big public works project. That's actually not the case. The Great Wall of China was kind of like a public works project, like filling a pothole in Manhattan. It never ends. You're like, what? I'm sorry. The Great Wall of China has been under construction, or had been under construction, for quite literally thousands of years. Before China was unified, it was a collection of kingdoms. And each kingdom was still experiencing encroachments by nomads from the north. So these kingdoms began building sections of walls in order to protect their northern border. When China would be unified, the new government would be like, all right, well, let's take this section of wall and this section of wall and let's connect it. And that's what the construction of the Great Wall of China. Now, how many of you have seen photos of the Great Wall of China or have actually ever been there? Have you been there? Or?
No, I have seen pictures.
Seen photos? Okay. So the images that you see of the Great Wall with the stone casing and the big towers, that's actually the newest version of the wall. The wall used to just be a collection of dirt. Some of it still exists. This is what the Great Wall would have looked like when it was still being constructed. Just basically rammed earth. Not real fancy. Rammed earth sections of wall, they had been built by rival kingdoms during the Warring States period, and then the unifying governments of the Qin and the Han dynasties began connecting them. And then the Sui government, and then the Ming government, and all kinds of things. But it was the Ming dynasty that really turned the wall into what we recognize when we see the wall. Capped in stone. Donald Trump approved. Right? So the earthworks were encased in stone to add strength and durability, and then towers provided line of sight and a beacon system for communication. So think about the third Lord of the Rings movie, you know, the beacons of Gondor are lit. That wasn't created in a vacuum. That kind of copied what the Great Wall was originally designed to do. So these towers would be manned by small forces of soldiers that were not really there to defend the wall. They were there to look for attackers. And if attackers were seen, they'd light a torch, and the torch would go all the way to the capital of the Chinese government. We're under attack. And then the emperor would start raising an army, and then the wall would essentially just be abandoned to act as an obstacle, to slow the invading army down long enough for the Chinese army to deploy, I guess you would say.
Why not fight them right there then?
Because the wall was so big. I mean, they did have forces on the wall, and I'm sure they did try to defend sections of it if they could concentrate enough forces to do it. But if you're being attacked by an army of 30, 40,000 men, and you've only got a couple hundred dudes within that section of wall, it's not going to hold.
Okay.
But the wall itself was designed to just be a barrier, to slow the army down, so that the Chinese army would be able to deploy and fight, hopefully, in more favorable conditions. Okay. West Africa, let's talk a little bit about them. West Africa saw three trade kingdoms rise and fall, very wealthy, very powerful kingdoms. Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. Ghana was the first, but it was very small. This dark red line represents the boundaries of Ghana. Mali is the yellow and orange kingdom, and then the kind of off-red outline. This is Songhai. Songhai was the biggest. Mali was probably the wealthiest, but between Mali and Songhai, it'd be too close to call. So in the 15th century, West Africa had two very wealthy empires. One was in a steep decline, Mali, and the other was in rapid ascent, Songhai. Now, Mali had reached the peak of their power in the 1400s, but Mali was around, it was formed in 1235, and it lasted until 1670. It was renowned for its wealth, but its power and stability was significantly waning. And the reason being was the Malian government was set up to be a unitary system, but it didn't have much of a bureaucracy. So the king was the one that made Mali rise. Really, it was the strength of the king that allowed Mali to be successful. And if they had a weak king, Mali was in big trouble. Songhai had more of a bureaucracy where it can kind of deal with weak kings, because they had other administrators and different levels of the government that could still function. So like, for example, after 1406, there's very little historical record about the internal politics of Mali, and that's because Mali suffered through one weak king after another, and there was so much internal instability, historians didn't even really have time to write down what was going on. The Songhai Empire, on the other hand, which formed in 1464 and lasted until 1591, was built in the same model as Mali, but with a few little differences. It had more of an administrative body in its government, and it was a lot more expansionist in its foreign policy. Most of the territory that Songhai claimed was at the expense of Mali, including the most important trade city in West Africa, Timbuktu. I know we kind of use that as a kid, like, if you don't back away, I'm going to kick you to Timbuktu. It's actually a real place. It's not some imaginary place. And it was an incredibly important city for a long time. This is kind of what West Africa looked like in 1530. So Songhai was on the upswing. Mali had lost control of Timbuktu and they were declining, although Mali would actually outlive Songhai. Songhai got invaded and they collapsed. So Songhai suffered a dramatic collapse in the mid to late 16th century due to a combination of internal conflict, civil war, and they were finally finished off by an invasion by Morocco. But Songhai culture did survive for a long time, well into the 20th century. There was I guess you would call it a rump state that managed to hold on to some part of the Songhai Empire. It was called the Dendi Kingdom. They were eventually conquered by France in 1901, and that's when Songhai culture officially comes to an end. But both Mali and Songhai drew their wealth and power from two main sources, gold and salt. Now we all know why gold is valuable, but why would salt be valuable?
Taste, spice.
Okay, yeah, seasoning. But salt was actually used for a lot more than just seasoning. Preserving meat. Because this is before refrigeration. So if you have to store your food for the winter, you have to dry it out, and only salt can do that. At one point in time, salt was worth its weight in gold. If you had a pound of salt, it was worth a pound of gold. Yeah. Now think about how cheap salt is. We throw it on our roads, for God's sake. People that live in West Africa, like the Berbers that live in West Africa, they still harvest salt for their money. They go out into the Sahara, usually they own a couple of camels, and they'll just start digging. And they'll go into a salt flat with like pickaxes, and they'll cut out these gigantic blocks of salt. Load it on the camels, bring it back into the local town, and sell it to a refiner. It's not worth much, but it makes a living. The current state, the country of Mali, still makes the bulk of their money through gold mining. There is bajillions of pounds of gold in West Africa. It's ridiculous how much gold West Africa still produces. How many of you have ever heard of the king Mansa Musa? You have? Okay.
Yeah.
What do you know about Mansa Musa?
I know he was a king. I don't really know much, but yeah.
He is without question the most famous king in Mali. He's also one of my favorite historical figures. This is really the only image that exists. If you asked me this a week ago, I could have told you who did that drawing, but I think it was the Portuguese, maybe. Honestly, don't know. But this represents Mansa Musa sitting on his throne, holding a nugget of gold. Mansa Musa is probably the wealthiest man to ever lived. He would have made John D. Rockefeller look poor. That's how much money Mansa Musa was worth. This guy was loaded. So the Sahara Desert covers vast expanses of gold and salt. Most of it has been untapped because honestly, who wants to go into the desert? It's really hot. There's no water. I don't want to go. So the emperors of Mali and Songhai drew their wealth by claiming ownership of all gold nuggets that would be dug up by the miners. So if there was a nugget, like beyond a certain weight, it belonged to the king and it would immediately be sent to the palace. The dust was used for everybody else. So gold dust was how everybody else made their money. Malian kings also relied very heavily on Arab traders to move their goods across the desert because the Arabs had the monopoly on camels. And camels are the only animals that could survive in deserts for prolonged periods of time. So imagine this. This is kind of like a partnership made in heaven, because you've got, on one hand, all of the kingdoms of West Africa that are separated from the trade routes of Europe and China and the Middle East by a desert. But the Arabs come in with the camels, let's do business. The West Africans had the goods, The Arabs had the transportation. Perfect partnership. So, in order to make this work, interactions with Arab traders encouraged West African merchants and then later statesmen to begin converting to Islam. Because honestly, think about this. If this is your main avenue of getting your goods to market, you want to be able to have a good relationship with your merchants, which means you're going to learn to speak their language and you're probably going to adopt their religion. This is how Islam spread into North Africa. It was all through trade. Commoners generally kept their traditional religions, but there was about a window of 100 to 200 years when the rulers of Mali, for example, would be Muslim and the commoners would be their own traditional religions. But after about 200 years, pretty much everybody had converted because it became just economically viable to do it. But the wealth of these kingdoms cannot be understated at all. Mansa Musa, after he converted to Islam, he went on his pilgrimage to Mecca and he made a pit stop in Cairo. And while he was in Cairo, actually marching to Mecca, what he did is he brought an army of bodyguards, about 100,000 men, according to contemporary sources. And the men that marched with him didn't bring weapons because they were in friendly territory and he was going on a religious pilgrimage. But what these men did do is each of them carried a 6-pound brick of gold. Can you imagine 100,000 men each carrying a brick of gold? That's crazy. That's 600,000 pounds of gold. When Mansa Musa got to Cairo, he felt like being a little generous and he started giving gold away, just giving it away. He gave away so much gold in Cairo, he depressed the gold market in Cairo for 2 years. Gold became almost worthless in Cairo because there was so much of it in circulation. Can you imagine being that wealthy? Right? That's how much gold this guy is worth. Quite by accident, but yeah, he literally collapsed the value of gold in Egypt for 2 years. And it took 2 years for that gold to filter out of Egypt. Timbuktu was also an incredible place of learning. I know this building doesn't really look like much, but this was the University of Timbuktu. And Timbuktu was the Harvard of Africa. People from all over the world, Europe, China, the Middle East, they all came to Timbuktu to study. How many of you have ever heard of something called the Baghdad House of Wisdom? What about the Library of Alexandria? There have been a couple places throughout history where these gigantic academies would be built by scholars and was supposed to serve as a major hub of learning. The first real big one was the Library of Alexandria, built on the orders of Ptolemy, one of the Ptolemies, after he took over Egypt after Alexander the Great died. And the library was a collection of all this arcane knowledge and ancient scrolls and ancient books that would all be gathered at Alexandria for scholars from all around the world to come and study from. Now, the library itself was burned down when the Romans got a hold of Egypt. It was an accident, but still nonetheless one of the greatest intellectual disasters in history. The Muslim Caliphate built us something similar. It's called the Baghdad House of Wisdom. And the Baghdad House of Wisdom was a combination of a college, hospital, and research facility all wrapped into one. And it was properly named too, because the Baghdad House of Wisdom, let's say for example you ever had the opportunity to go into one. Let's say you were a medical student, and a medical student from, I don't know, Italy. And you travel to the Baghdad House of Wisdom to learn more about medicine. Well, you'd go into the library and you'd go to the section with medical knowledge, and you would find books written by Persians, by Chinese, by Japanese, by Africans, by Hungarians, by Russians, by all of these different groups, and all of those books will be translated into a language that you can understand. So you'd be able to draw from knowledge from all over the world. Well, the Baghdad House of Wisdom was destroyed by the Mongolians, but the kings of Mali wanted one like that, and they built one. So Timbuktu is Africa's copying of the Baghdad House of Wisdom, and that one survived. Really feel-good story in history, and it involves ISIS, and usually you would not put ISIS with feel-good in the same sentence. But a splinter group of ISIS a couple of years ago went into Timbuktu and took the city over. And because a lot of the knowledge that was in the library predates Islam, because it's really ancient books, ISIS was there to destroy it. But the librarians and the researchers in the university smuggled it all out of the city. If they were caught, they would have been killed. But they piled them all into boxes and chests and got them out of the city, smuggled them all out. That stuff has since been distributed to colleges and universities all around the world, where it's currently being preserved, cleaned up, researched, and translated. So that knowledge survived. Like I said, feel good. Speaking of the destruction of the House of Wisdom, this is an Arab representation of the destruction of Baghdad in 1258. So the Islamic world was undergoing a paradigm shift by the mid-1400s. The long-lived Abbasid Caliphate, which was the third caliphate, probably the most powerful. It wasn't the largest, but it was one of the most powerful. It really was on its last legs. In 1258, the Mongols attacked Baghdad, sacked the city, destroyed the House of Wisdom, and beheaded the caliph. The Mongolian warlord that was in charge of that was a guy named Hulagu. Funny story about Hulagu. He was the one that destroyed Baghdad and ordered the execution of the caliph. And then Hulagu converted to Islam and vowed that he would go to war against the Mongolians that killed the caliph. He was the one that did it. But he turned around, looked at his cousin and said, "You did it. How dare you? I'm going to kill you now." And these two factions of the Mongols went to war with each other for something that Hulagu did. It's like when your sibling breaks the lamp and then blames you for it. And rats you out to your mom and then gives your mom the stick with which she beats you with. All right, so the successors of the Abbasid Caliphate, a group of people called the Mamluks. And the Mamluks, it's really weird to categorize who the Mamluks were. They were not Arabs. Most of them were Turkish from Central Asia. But they're referred to as slave soldiers. And this is weird because they were soldiers, but they were property of the government. It's not like they were independent and they didn't earn a wage. But the government owned them and trained them. And they were there to fight on behalf of the caliph. But the Mamluks, loyal to the caliph, reestablished Abbasid rule in Cairo, Egypt in 1261. And it was the Mamluks that actually defeated the Mongolians and kept them from expanding further into the Middle East. And there in Cairo, the Mamluks ruled until 1543, when they were subjugated by the new up-and-coming power in the region, the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman Turks. Just to give you an idea, this is the size, or this is a map of the Abbasid Caliphate at its height. It was enormous. So Algeria, Tunisia, or what is now Libya, for example, Egypt, all of the Arabian Peninsula, which includes Oman and Yemen, Jordan, Syria, Iran, Iraq, parts of Azerbaijan. Like, it was huge. It was an enormous empire, one of the largest empires in the world. It even got into Sicily and conquered the island of Crete. This was what followed it, the Ottoman Empire. Now this map represents all of the expansion of the Ottoman Empire, which is really odd because this is going to be hard to see, but this little brown dot right there, that's where the Ottomans began. And they just went from this little tiny piece of land, conquered all of this. So the Ottoman Empire controlled Libya, Egypt, Israel, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, part of Arabia, all of Turkey, all of Greece, all of Bulgaria, most of Hungary, and all of Romania. They even made it into Venice. Not Venice, I'm sorry, Vienna. Made it into Austria, besieged the capital of Vienna twice. Big, big empire. So by 1450, the Ottoman Empire was rapidly becoming the military powerhouse of the world, which is amazing when you consider that they started as a tiny state in western Anatolia, what is now known as Turkey. The Ottoman state rapidly and aggressively expanded its territory into the Balkans, all the way to the gates of Constantinople. They're the ones that finished off the Roman Empire in 1453 by capturing the city of Constantinople and eventually renaming it Istanbul. All right, so let's talk about Europe's crash course. and how, what Europe was like. So the Middle East was doing all right. They were in a transition period from one empire to another. A little bit of a chaotic phase in between, but essentially from one centralized authority, and then about 100, 200 years later, another centralized authority that spent money on education, on border security, on medical advances, all kinds of things. If someone were to send me back in time to the year 1000, but I get to choose the location, I am not going to go visit my ancestors in Italy. Hell no. I don't feel like dying of plague today. I'm going to go to Baghdad or I'm going to go to China. As for Europe, however, and this is where you can kind of see the Eurocentrism of Western history, the Middle Ages is often referred to as the Dark Ages. Well, it was dark only for Europe. The rest of the world was doing pretty damn well. Europe wasn't. Europe was a hot mess. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire in 476 was apocalyptic for Western Europe, and I don't use that word lightly. I literally mean end of the world kind of scenario. There was no law, there was no infrastructure maintenance, there was no protection, and there was no order in a geographic area that would eventually become the countries of France, Italy, England, Spain, and Portugal. That whole area lost all semblance of centralized authority.
The Purge?
Hmm?
Purge?
The Purge. Imagine you woke up tomorrow morning and found out that the entirety of the American government and New York government disappeared.
I'm having my class.
I'm still waiting for that one sociopath in my class to go, I'd have a great time. So for centuries, Western Europe convulsed in its struggle to maintain order. Big kingdoms or kingdoms would rise and fall rapidly. They would go to war with each other. They swallowed up each other. Big kingdoms would destroy smaller ones and absorb them. Borders were always in flux. Dynasties rose and fell violently. There was political assassinations. An example would be one king of England brought his 6 rivals into a common dinner and then poisoned them all because that's what you do. That was one of the Viking kings of England. So when you watch Game of Thrones and you see the Red Wedding, yeah, George R. Martin is totally ripping off history. There was one minor, I guess you can say, lull in the chaos. This right here, the Carolingian Empire, but it only lasted for 88 years. Yeah, that's it, 88 years. I know, only. Well, yeah, I guess you could say it's a long time because in this period of time, the common life expectancy was somewhere around 40. If you made it to 40, you were ancient. If you made it to 30, you were old. If you were 14 and you didn't have kids, what you waiting for? I'm making this up. Yeah, there was a lull kind of in the chaos of Europe. Charles the Great, we refer to him as Charlemagne, established the Carolingian Empire in the year 800. And it did, for a time, stabilize the West. It also is what led to a massive expansion of Christianity into Germany, because the Germans were still worshiping Odin when Charlemagne came in. And he's like, I'm going to teach you the light of Jesus, even if I have to kill you. And he did. But the empire only lasted 88 years before it tore itself apart. And the main reason is Charlemagne had a bunch of kids. And when Charlemagne died, all his kids were like, I want to be the next king. No, I want to be the next king. And then they started killing each other.
Wow.
Because that's what you do. Nothing quite says sibling rivalry than when you bury an axe in your brother's head. England was in deep shit from 793 to 1000. To the year 1000, England was being invaded by pretty much everybody under the sun. England had kind of coalesced into a group of kingdoms set up by a Germanic tribe called the Saxons, which moved in when the Romans moved out. But between 793 and 1000, there were Vikings, Scandinavians coming from what is now Norway and Sweden, that landed in Britain, saw the farmland, and were like, cool, let's take this place. Especially when you consider the first raid in England, Viking raid in England. The Vikings landed next to a monastery in a town called Lindisfarne. And they went in and they just found a bunch of monks clinging to their crosses. And the Vikings are like, wow, these guys are so easy to kill. Let's conquer the whole place. A Viking army, for example, besieged captured and sacked the city of Paris in 845. 20 years later, the Viking army invaded England and conquered half of the island. Yep. So, they were finally stopped by an English king called Alfred the Great. And Alfred the Great didn't even liberate England. He just stopped the Vikings from taking all of it. A couple of sources from Alfred's victory does survive. Quote, fighting ferociously, forming a dense shield wall against the whole army of the pagans, and striving long and bravely, at last Alfred gained the victory. He overthrew the pagans with great slaughter. Very violent period in time in history. So England was in deep shit. But the Vikings did also give us something else. First off, they gave us an amazing SpongeBob reference. Leif Erikson. Also, the Vikings were the first Europeans to discover North America. Not Christopher Columbus. Although the Vikings didn't tell anybody. In 999, if you had any interaction with a Viking, usually it involved him killing you and looting your corpse. So it's not like, hey, guess what? We discovered this new landmass. I'm going to kill you now. Leif Erikson is the first European to make it to North America. He was helping his father set up a colony in what is now Greenland. And I love this. The Vikings purposely named Greenland Greenland when it's actually an ice cube. And they named Iceland Iceland when it's actually this paradise. And that was so that when people heard about it, they're like, I'm not going to Iceland, I'm going to go to Greenland. And the Vikings were sitting there, sucker. So Leif Erikson was helping his father set up a colony in Greenland. He got blown off course in a storm and he landed in Canada, Newfoundland essentially. By the way, Newfoundland, that's Norse for new found land. I'm not making this up. He landed in an area he later called Vinland, land of grapes, because apparently there were a lot of grapes grown there. Leif Erikson set up a colony in Vinland that lasted for about 2 years and some change, but it fell apart because when Leif Erikson landed there, he was there with about 30 dudes and 2 women. Yeah, that would drive me nuts too. So they just abandoned it. As for Europe though, can you kill the light? Kind of want to add a little bit of contrast to this. Thank you. This is a painting by a German artist called Peter Bruegel, and it's called The Triumph of Death. It was painted in 1562. Art is a reflection of culture and history. Do you think this Peter Bruegel guy lived in a rosy environment?
No.
No. I know that, first off, if I had the canvas in this painting would be enormous. But you've got a bunch of skeletons dressed in togas throwing people who have weights around their neck into a river so they could drown. You've got an army of skeletons just raping and massacring and burning. You've got corpses piled up all in the back, and all of these people are supposedly being dragged into hell. So this is how Peter Bruegel saw Europe in 1562. Who wants to go to Europe in 1562?
No.
All right, so in a nutshell, Europe was an unmitigated disaster. Would you please get the light again? Sorry. Europe was an unmitigated disaster for centuries. Life expectancy was incredibly low. Very few people made it past 40. Disease, famine, and war were common occurrences. One of the primary factors for this is Europe has a very high concentration of ethnic groups and a very small geographic location. And human nature, when you meet something that is foreign to you or is not familiar to you, humans have the fight or flight reaction, which means you either run away from it or you fight it. That's how we're hard programmed. Because the more open and accepting humans, we're all eaten by saber-toothed tigers. Because they all look at the kitty, chomp. So we're hardwired, we're programmed to fear things that are unfamiliar to us. So when you have a high concentration of ethnic groups in a very small geographic location, you're going to have a lot of ethnic violence. Crazy amounts of ethnic violence. Europe is probably the most violent place on earth. And that's because the ethnic groups that lived in Europe didn't have anywhere to run to. So the only thing they could do was fight to defend their own territorial integrity. So because of the constrained geography and high concentration of ethnic groups, it is a hotbed for ethnic violence, as reflected by Peter Bruegel's painting. But only a couple of years after Peter Bruegel painted that, You had the Renaissance. So how do you go from this to this in just a couple of decades? What changed? Someone took over. Trust me, a lot of people took over and they were not able to issue or to solve that. No idea. It's okay.
Like, did they change like the way they was living? Like, instead of like following like God, like they was like.
No, people during the Renaissance were still very religious.
Is it not the Age of Enlightenment?
The Enlightenment comes after the Renaissance. How many of you have ever heard of the Renaissance, actually? Okay. How many of you have ever been to the Metropolitan Theater and seen, or Metropolitan Museum and seen Renaissance artwork? Okay. What do you notice about the artwork? How would you describe it? Is it shitty or is it really good?
It's good.
Yeah, it's really good, right? It's amazing how much you can understand from history just by looking at art. Think about some of the great works of the Renaissance that you may or may not have seen, and the quality of it. How long do you think it took those artists to perfect their craft? An entire lifetime. Especially if you see like the marble sculptures, like La Pieta, which was carved by Raphael. Raphael lived until his 90s, by the way, and he was practicing art to the day he died, still thinking he wasn't good enough. And La Pieta is, for those, if you have your phone, I forget how to spell it. La Pieta is a marble sculpture of the Mother Mary cradling the corpse of Jesus. And the quality of this marble sculpture is unreal because it is so lifelike. Even if you just look at the details, like the detail in the hands of Mary, or the details in the feet and ankles of Jesus, or just the folds in Mary's robes, it's unreal, especially when you consider that it's carved out of a rock. The amount of time that it takes these artists to put into their craft tells you one big thing. They did not spend any of their time in the fields. They were not farmers. So, if they weren't farmers, that means they didn't have to worry about food. Right? So a couple of things that contributed to the Renaissance. First off, accepting the fact that Europe is an incredibly violent place, or at least it was, it still kind of is. There was a crazy amount of political and technological experimentation going on in Europe. The political experimentation was to try to find peaceful solutions to ethnic problems, and the technological experimentation was to find violent solutions to the ethnic tensions. Because you can't have tensions with a rival ethnicity if you just wipe them out, right? Trust me, genocide seems to be inherent to the human condition. For example, does anybody know where gunpowder was invented? China, right? Anybody know the years, give or take?
1700.
Actually, long before that.
1400.
Even longer.
Nah.
900s. Yeah, that's a good guess, man. Yeah, right about the 900s, the Chinese developed gunpowder. The first firearms weren't built until about 1400. So there's a 500-year window where gunpowder existed. Does anybody know who invented firearms?
European. Oh no, Spain, right?
Europeans, but the Estonians. The oldest known firearm dates back to 1396 in Estonia. So you're telling me that the Chinese had gunpowder for 500 years, but they didn't come up with firearms?
There's nothing fun with it. They're making firecrackers.
Yeah, well, but they also used them for rockets. So the Chinese thought that they had found the purpose for gunpowder, and there really wasn't any need to develop anything else because their fighting techniques were effective. But in Europe, there was so much violence going on that armor technology had improved dramatically. People were going into battle with these gigantic plates of iron strapped to their bodies. And someone had to come up with an idea, how do you get past that metal plate to kill the guy wearing it? Well, you have the development of crossbows, but crossbows take forever to reload. And then someone's like, well, if I take this funny substance that I got from China and I stick it in a metal pipe, and then I put a metal ball on the other end of that pipe and set off the gunpowder, I can kill a guy in the metal suit. That's where firearms were developed. You're like, oh shit. Right. But it was the political experimentation and the technological experimentation that led directly to the Renaissance. Now, there are 6 contributing factors to why the Renaissance happened. First and foremost, you've got the endurance of the Roman Empire. Yes, the empire that died 1,500 years ago still affects us today. You had massive contributions from Islam. You had massive contributions from the Catholic Church. The Crusades were a contributing factor. Italian merchants were a contributing factor. And finally, the gluttony of the upper classes of Europe. All of these contributed to the Renaissance. So first off, let's talk about the endurance of the Roman Empire. When the Roman Empire fell in 476, only the western half of the empire fell, because the administrative center, the capital of the empire, had been moved east to the city of Constantinople. So when the western provinces fell to the Germans, the empire continued on. Now historians refer to this second iteration of Rome as the Byzantine Empire. But if you were to go back in time and visit Constantinople and you called somebody a Byzantine, they would look at you and be like, what the fuck's a Byzantine? Because they called themselves Roman, even though they spoke Greek. So to the Romans, Rome officially did not die. The empire existed. It was a little bit embarrassing that the Roman Empire existed without actually controlling the city of Rome, but the empire was alive and well in their mind. And there were a lot of emperors of the eastern half of the empire that had the dream of wanting to rebuild the empire, build it to its former glory, conquer all of the territories that had been lost, reestablish Roman rule as a united empire, and then continue Rome's golden age, or usher in another golden age. And the Byzantine Emperor Justinian I was the closest to come by. His campaigns saw the Byzantine armies reconquer Italy, North Africa that the Western Empire had lost, and even parts of Spain. And by 555, the Byzantine Empire was at the peak of its power. Size and power. Now, even though the Western Empire collapsed, the Eastern Empire, with the administrative capital of Rome, still had access to all of the technology and science that made the Roman Empire the jewel of the civilized world for that period of time. Now, the Byzantines had access to this knowledge. They expanded upon it. They didn't share it with anybody for very good reasons, but it's not like that knowledge just disappeared. And then when the Byzantine Empire re-expanded back into former Western territories, they brought that knowledge with them. They began rebuilding academies, rebuilding libraries, rebuilding schools and state buildings and that kind of thing. So Roman learning began filtering throughout all of Byzantine holdings in Europe, in North Africa, and in the Middle East. When Constantinople, the capital city right here, finally fell in 1453 and the empire was officially killed off, Byzantine scholars went to the most logical place where they would be able to find shelter. They went to Italy. So it's not like Roman learning disappeared. It just moved. Which brings me to the second part. Keep this map in the back of your head. Kind of try to remember where Byzantine territory was, especially in North Africa and in this region. Because this is a contribution of Islam. After the Prophet Muhammad passed away and Abu Bakr took power, Abu Bakr and his successors went on a dramatic expansion of the empire, really. Building the caliphate, building the Islamic empire. And a lot of the territory that they took were former Byzantine territories. Now this is what separates the Muslim conquests from the German conquests in the West. The Germanic tribes that invaded Western Rome, their entire culture was based on the concept of strength. That's how warlords would take power. They would take power by fighting and killing their rivals and destroying their enemies. So when the Germanic tribes made it into the Western territories and they defeated Rome's armies and they captured Roman cities, they didn't see Roman, and really anything Roman, as worth saving. Except maybe the bathhouses, because they were warm and comfortable. But that was it. Any kind of Roman knowledge, books, scrolls, was burned. Because the Germans would be like, well, why do I need to save this from an inferior culture that we have conquered? The Muslims were different. The Prophet Muhammad, and I forget where, I think it's in the Quran, I'm not entirely sure. But one of the quotes from the Prophet Muhammad, and I'm paraphrasing here, was essentially to saying, if you want to understand the will of God, you need to understand the world that God has created. So the Prophet Muhammad kind of encouraged scientific study. So when the Muslim armies took over Byzantine territory, they did not destroy anything. They went into the Byzantine libraries and the Byzantine state houses and palaces and capitals and were like, we can use this. So all of it was brought into places like the Baghdad House of Wisdom, for example, and it was expanded upon. It was translated, it was studied, and it was expanded upon. Roman medicine became the foundation for Islamic medicine. And Muslims got so good at medicine, by the year 1200, they were performing surgery on people without killing them. There was a Muslim doctor that, quite by accident, discovered germ theory, didn't even know he found germ theory. It was a medical book that he wrote, and essentially saying, paraphrasing once again, I have discovered that if I move my patients into an area where they can breathe clean air, they have lower rates of infection and higher rates of survival. Well, yeah, you take a patient, you get them out of a dirty room, put them somewhere clean, they don't get infection, germ theory, because the bacteria aren't around. Meanwhile, Europeans were bringing their pigs into their houses to keep them from freezing to death. So the expansion of the Islamic Caliphate came at the expense of the Byzantine Empire. And Muslims, like I said, came into direct contact with Roman learning, preserved it, expanded upon it, and that kind of thing. Next comes the Catholic Church. Now, the Catholic Church gets a lot of crap for during the Middle Ages. A lot of it is kind of deserved. The Catholic Church in the Middle Ages was more of a political entity than a religious one. Boy, the popes loved playing politics. They loved power. But the monks, on the other hand, they were dedicated to the faith. And one of the things that's kind of annoying to hear, people, especially today with the edgy teenagers, love saying that the Catholic Church and Catholicism, Christianity for that matter, retarded scientific development in Western Europe. I want to say that's not true. Civil war and famine retarded scientific development in Western Europe. Because it's really hard to do research and technology when you're fighting to survive. Nobody's going to study new things and try to develop new cures for diseases when you've got Vikings knocking on your door to chop your head off. Right? The Catholic Church did a lot to try to save as much as they could. Keep in mind, the Catholic Church saw itself as the successor to the Roman Empire. It's why Catholic sermons for the longest time were done in Latin. It's why we know how to speak Latin today. Latin survived through the church. Otherwise, it wouldn't have existed. No one would know how to speak Latin. So the church saw anything Roman as worthwhile, something that was worth preserving, something that was worth saving. And the monks, especially after the Germanic conquest, the monks went out of their way to try to save as much Roman stuff as they possibly could get their hands on. And the stuff that wasn't burned was hidden. So Catholic monks would preserve, study, and copy Roman manuscripts that survived the collapse of the Western Empire. Now, church officials were not real keen on sharing this information for a couple of reasons. One, because of superstition. They were afraid that people would destroy it. That's a fair thing. But also because of power politics. The church did not want to enlighten or to educate their followers. I mean, think about this. If you're a pope or you're a bishop and you're really keen on keeping a huge amount of power and influence, the last thing you want to do is to educate the people that you control. Keep people stupid, keep them enslaved, pretty much. And the church was notorious for doing that. But the ruling classes of Europe had access to this stuff. Another common misconception is that the European nobility in the Middle Ages were dumb. They weren't. A lot of them were highly educated that can speak multiple languages. Generally, most of the European nobility, the upper class, and especially the governing class, like the monarchs, received at the very least rudimentary education, so that they could at least read and write. But many of them were highly educated. European families that had money actually sent their children to Timbuktu to study. Crazy, right? Some Europeans were incredibly educated. There was a emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, which wasn't holy, wasn't Roman, it wasn't an empire, but it was kind of like a German confederation. And the emperor controlled Germanic-speaking territory, Italian-speaking territory, French-speaking territory, and Spanish-speaking territory. And there's kind of a joke, and it's a joke said by Emperor Charles V, and I mean this is more of like an urban legend. You can't really verify it, but it's still a pretty funny story. Someone apparently asked him how he keeps all of the languages straight. How does he speak 5 languages? He says, well, I speak Latin to God, Italian to women, French to men, Spanish to my servants, and German to my horse. And that's how he keeps all of his languages straight. All right. Next, we have the Crusades. A lot of myths pertaining about the Crusades. Anybody know anything about the Crusades? Nope. Yeah.
That was like the spread of like Catholic Church.
Kind of. The Crusades were a series of holy wars that were launched to try to reclaim the Holy Land in the name of God.
It lasted for like 100 years.
200 years, actually. On and off. There were, all figured, I think there were like 8 or 9 crusades. Only one of them was successful. Oh, man, I'm not even going to tell you about the Children's Crusade. Boy, that was a shit show. Okay, here's the deal with the Crusades. In 1096, there was the reigning pope at the time was Pope Urban II. He called for a crusade to reclaim the Holy Land, specifically Jerusalem, in the name of the Catholic faith, to restore the kingdom of God to Christian control. Common misconception about the Crusades was that it was a purely religious issue, that it was a war between Christian and Islam. Now, on the surface, that is completely true, because all of the soldiers, or most of the soldiers that joined the crusade, did so to be good Christians, to kill non-believers, Muslims, right? But there was a lot of underlying causes to the Crusades as well. Consider this. The city of Jerusalem fell into Muslim control around 670, give or take. So for roughly 500 years, the supposed holy city was in Islamic hands. Why didn't the church call for an immediate crusade to restore Christian rule over what was a Christian city? Why did it take them 500 years to do that? One, because the church was too busy fighting itself. There are 2 main branches of the Christian church. You've got the Roman Catholic and the Eastern Orthodox. They were once a united church because they were all founded by the Romans. But they split after the fall of the Western Roman Empire because the western half of the church wanted to speak Latin and the eastern half of the church wanted to speak Greek. And both sides were claiming that they were the more legitimate church. And they were fighting over some really dumb things. Like, one of the things that contributed to the Great East-West Schism was what type of bread you use for sacrament. Do you use bread with yeast or without yeast? One side says, throw in the yeast. And the other side says, no yeast, you heathen devil pagan. And that led to hundreds of years of infighting within the Christian church until they finally agreed to just kind of leave each other alone after trying to massacre each other for, because that's what you do. Yes?
Was that how the Protestant came about?
No, the Protestant Reformation started with Martin Luther, and that was a split within the Roman Catholic Church. The Eastern Orthodox Church has remained mostly unchanged for the last 1,000 years, 1,500 years, give or take. Also, the Eastern Orthodox Church does not have a pope. The Roman Catholic Church does. Because the Eastern Orthodox Church claims that there was no precedent to create a pope. Because Jesus was the messenger, now we just have a faith. The Eastern Orthodox Church in structure actually is very similar to the structure of Islam. Because Islam doesn't have a pope either. There is no one central figure that controls the entirety of the faith. And you've got different iterations of the faith. The Eastern Orthodox Church is the same way. But the Roman Catholic Church, all hail the Pope. Okay, so as for the Crusades, on the surface, yes, it was a holy war between Catholic and non-Catholic, between Christian and Muslim. But there was a lot of underlying factors, because if it was purely a religious matter, I like to think the Crusades would have been launched way earlier. But they weren't. There was a huge political element to this as well. First off, you have to understand that in 1096, Europe was still literally ripping itself apart. These are Christians killing Christians. And the belief is, if you kill your fellow Christian, you go to hell. Right? So why were Christians massacring Christians? And I'm not just talking killing in war. I mean, they were like raping and pillaging and like doing all the worst sins in all the newest ways. And the Pope had to deal with that. Because the Pope was like, man, how do I get Christians to stop killing Christians? On top of that, the Pope himself, Urban II, the duly elected Pope, was having a bit of a problem himself because he was not seen as legitimate. Now, he was elected by the Council of Cardinals, or by the College of Cardinals. But Pope Urban came from France. And France was having a rivalry with the Holy Roman Empire. And the Holy Roman Empire used parts of Italy as its little puppet, including the church. So one of the emperors of the Holy Roman Empire didn't like the fact that the Pope was French. So what he did is he organized to have an Italian Pope also claim to be Pope. So in 1096, there were 2 popes. One French Pope, one Italian Pope. Pope Urban II was kicked out of Rome. And he had to hide in France. So he called what he called the Council of Clermont, because he met in the city of Clermont in France. And Pope Urban was like, ooh, this is a mess. So how do I, 1, get people to see me as the legitimate Pope, 2, get Christians to kill Christians, or to stop killing Christians, and 3, make some money on this? I have an idea. Let's tell all of the Christians that if they want to be good Christians, they'll go kill Muslims. And all the Christians were like, ah! So in 1096, Pope Urban II called for a holy war to reclaim Jerusalem in the name of Christianity, even though it had been in Muslim hands for 500 years. I mean, think about this. Now, if you put yourself in the position of a European soldier, mercenary, brigand, knight, whatever it was, you are up to your waist in Christian blood from a lifetime of war. And now the Pope is telling you, hey, if you go campaign for the kingdom of God, you will be forgiven of your sins. Man, feet don't fail me now. I am off to the Holy Land to save my soul. Right? And that's why the First Crusade successfully conquered this swath of territory in what is now modern-day Israel, as well as parts of Egypt, parts of Turkey, and parts of Syria. And the First Crusade was successful. And they established a couple of Christian kingdoms. You have the Principality of Antioch, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and there was one more. It's like the County of Edessa. All right, so what did this do, though? Now, another common misconception about the Crusades was that it was 200 years of endless slaughter. It's actually not the case. The Crusades, most of the time, was a very boring affair. So the armies of the Crusades would gather. For the First Crusade, they came in as invaders, so they were fighting pretty heavily. And when the First Crusade captured the city of Jerusalem, they purged the city of all non-Christians. So Jews living in the city, Muslims living in the city, were all butchered. Men, women, children, they were all killed. By the way, the Islamic world has never forgiven Christianity for that. And rightfully so, because the entire city was purged. I mean, we're talking tens of thousands of people were killed. But when the campaigns would end, the Crusaders would have to find houses, they'd build castles, they had to, kind of establish, fortify their positions and live their lives and govern. So the Crusades were not 200 years of endless slaughter. Usually what would happen would be like a couple of really big bloody battles and then years of like a Cold War. A couple of border skirmishes. And then a couple of really big bloody battles and then years of stalemate where no one would fight. And it was in those lull years that the Crusaders had to live their lives, which means they had to get houses, they had to furnish their buildings, display their wealth. And I mean, it's not like they can go to the local Walmart or IKEA to get furniture and a rug. They have to interact with the merchants in the region, which means they began interacting with Arab merchants. Now, gold knows no faith. Gold knows no God. So a Muslim would be like, yeah, you invaded my territory, but you have gold. I'll take gold. And the Christians will be like, well, you're a non-believer, but you have a rug and I need a rug. Have some gold. But keep in mind, the Islamic world also had access to all of this old Roman technology and Roman science, which had been expanded upon by Muslim scholars. So now, let's say you're a crusader and you're going to go buy a couch or something, and you come up to your favorite merchant, and the merchant's like, oh, check this out. It's this old book written by the Romans. And you'd be like, ooh, I can't read it, but it's still cool. I'll buy it. And then you put it on a ship and you send it back home. Yo, dear bro, dear sister, check this out. Have it translated. I'm curious what it says. So over time, as the Crusader kingdoms were established, the kingdom of Jerusalem lasted for 84 years. there was a lot of wealth flowing into the Crusader states, and then by extension, flowing back into Europe. So, the Crusades, in a nutshell, yanked Europe out of the economic depression that had plagued it for centuries. It was an injection of money and materials and science and learning and all kinds of stuff, just being injected into Europe. All of it came through Italy, by the way. And the Italians are like, ooh, mamma mia, look at all this money. So the Europeans were essentially reintroduced to the Roman knowledge that they had lost 600 years prior, as well as the advances made by Muslim scholars. There were Europeans that were buying Islamic medical texts and then experimenting at home. And some of them were like, hey, look, I could do surgery on this guy without killing him. Yay! It was really cool. The Crusades also temporarily relieved Europe of major internal conflict, because the Pope was saying all good Christians would stop killing Christians and start killing infidels. So if there were a couple of kingdoms that were, at each other's throats, the Pope would step in and be like, hey, why don't you guys settle your differences by go killing Muslims? And the Christians would be like, okay, that sounds good to me. And then they'd disappear and the problem would end. So you were bringing internal stability to Europe by ruining somebody else's day. That's kind of how the world works, though. But on top of the Crusades, now the Crusades ended after 200 years. But the trading didn't, because the Italians did not participate in the Crusades, at least not in large numbers. Italy was not a country yet. The Italian peninsula was broken up into these tiny little kingdoms and tiny little city-states, and most of them had trade fleets, and almost none of them had any big armies. Most of the Italians, when they would fight each other, they would hire mercenaries, because they had the money for it. So the Italians, the Crusaders would come into Italy, they're like, we come here to go to Jerusalem to reclaim it for the city, or to reclaim it for the glory of God. And the Italians would be like, cool, I'll put you on my ship, give me money. And the Italians were essentially the taxi service for the Crusades, ferrying people back and forth. Well, the Italians were over in the Holy Land, they would make contact with Arab merchants. Like, hey, I'm Italian, I'm actually not invading your territory, I'm just here to make some money. So when the Crusades ended, the Italians are like, look at all the trade routes we control. So when the Italians established these overseas trade routes, they began building overland trade routes. And when the Crusades ended, the trade continued. So an Italian merchant, for example, would come out of Naples, go to Alexandria in Egypt or Tyre or Antioch, buy a bunch of stuff that was either being produced in the Middle East or even in China, because there was a lot of overland trade between the Islamic world and China. And the Italians would buy it, send it back in Italy, put it on a cart, move it up to places like Paris, London, Danzig, Kiev in Ukraine, or even Novgorod in Russia. So just like that, if you were an Italian noble, or I'm sorry, if you were a European noble, didn't matter where you would go, you would be able to buy Chinese product from Italian merchants. And think about how much money the Italians were making. The Renaissance began in Italy. It's no surprise it began in Italy because the Italians were making all the money. What do rich people do when they try to show each other up? They buy stupid shit. And they buy a lot of it. So, one Italian merchant has enough money to buy a nice palace. And his competition is like, well, I'm going to buy a bigger palace. And then the first merchant's like, I can't have that. So I'm going to put a statue of a Greek god in the front of my palace. And the other's like, I can't have that. I'm going to paint my ceiling with naked people. And here come the artists. Hello, I have artist skills. And these Italian patrons were saying, all right, cool, Michelangelo, Leonardo, I am going to put you on retainer so you don't work for anybody else. You only work for me. And then you fill my palaces with all of this art. And that's what gave the Renaissance artists the ability to craft or to refine their craft, get really good at it, and still pay their bills. All right. European gluttony. The upper classes would desire exotic goods coming from the Middle East and from Asia. They got spices, silk, technology, that kind of thing. It was all really valuable. But anybody who knows anything about business, the more times a product changes hands, the higher the price goes. So if you're a spice manufacturer in China, you could sell a pound of spices for $1. By the time it makes it to London, that pound of spice is now worth $80. Because every time it changes hands of a merchant, each merchant has to make profit. So you're the producer, you sell it, you need to make some money. But the merchant that buys it from you and sells it to the next person, they have to make profit. And the next person has to make profit. So the price goes up and up and up and up and up. That's economics 101. So the Europeans that were getting access to this at the very end of the trade route, man, they were paying out the nose for stuff that would usually be cheap in China or in the Middle East. But all of the trade routes were controlled by either Arabs or Italians. So people like the Portuguese, the Spanish, the English, the French, they were trying to get access to these cheap goods without having to go through the Italians to do it. And they wanted to find direct trade routes to the east and cut out the Italian middlemen. Especially after the Mongolian Empire dissolved, and especially after the Ottoman Empire began to expand things. Because any Christian merchant that wanted to get into the Middle East would have to go through the Ottoman Empire, which was hostile to Christianity. And they ain't going to do business. So, in comes technology in the age of exploration. Now we know what caused the Renaissance and the desire to explore the world. The Renaissance was driven by the money that people were making off of the Crusades and the trade routes that were established during the Crusades. And then the global exploration was set up in order to get access to cheap materials so you didn't have to go through Italian merchants. Because the Italian merchants were making out like bandits. All right, but in order to establish a trade route into the east, you had to do it by ocean, because land travel was very dangerous and very long. But ocean travel was really difficult to do. Traveling from, let's say, England to New York, back then, a couple hundred years ago, would be as dangerous as if we tried to go from Earth to the moon. Seriously. For them, China may as well have been Mars for us. Because it took months of travel on the ocean. If you got on a rickety-ass little boat and you left Portugal, you would be on the ocean trying to go around Africa into China. You would be on that boat for about a year. Who wants to do that? So, ocean travel, however, the technology needed to be developed to do it. Now, like all things in life, if there is a desire for something, someone will fill that need. Now, the Chinese actually, inadvertently, created one of these major and super important navigation tools several hundred years before the Europeans even needed it, the magnetic compass. And the magnetic compass wasn't even designed as a directional tool. It was designed as a kind of like a religious or a medicinal thing. It was supposed to like help people focus their energies or something. And then the person that invented it is like, why is this always pointing south? I think I might have something here. Most great inventions, by the way, are invented by accident. Penicillin, by the way, total accident. The guy who discovered penicillin was trying to do something totally different. He's like, man, why does this fungus keep growing? Oh shit, it cures diseases. Nice. The Post-it note was invented by somebody who was trying to invent an industrial glue. And the glue he invented didn't work. But it works great for a Post-it note. Okay, so the magnetic compass was invented in China between 700, 900, no one really knows for sure. And it's a simple design, but it reliably pointed south. Now, maritime advances are what enabled Europeans to begin constructing ships capable of surviving open ocean travel. The old methods of traveling over the ocean required ships to hug the coastline and to anchor at night. Now, imagine if you're a merchant and you have to keep the shoreline in sight, because if you lose sight of the shore, you're lost. And you have to anchor at night so you don't run aground, right? Ruin your ship and possibly die. Well, where do you think the pirates are going to hang out?
Right by the shoreline.
Right by the shoreline. And they're going to attack you at night. You're like, oh shit. So you as a ship captain, you actually want to go out into open water so that you're harder to find, but at the same time, if you're harder to find, you're also more lost. So, but technology enabled that to happen. Also, ship technology in these days was not that much different from the late Roman Empire technology. The ships that were at use had really thin hulls, which means they broke apart during heavy storms, and they were pretty slow and they were not very maneuverable. But when the magnetic compass was introduced into Europe, the Europeans are like, well, at least we have a device that can point us to where we're going. But now you need a device that tells you where you are. In comes Arab technology. The astrolabe was, I believe, developed by Arabs, and the sextant was actually invented by Europeans. These kind of do the same thing. The astrolabe tracks star movement and the movement of the moon. This tracks movement of the sun. Now, I'm not entirely sure how the astrolabe works, but I can tell you how the sextant works. The sextant helps you draw an angle between the sun and the horizon. So if you know what time of day it is, and you know what angle the sun and the horizon make, you can kind of figure out where on Earth you are. Another common myth is that people thought the Earth was flat in the 1400s. That is not the case. Anybody who did anything on ocean travel or had a brain knew that the Earth was round. And that's how they knew that with the sextant you can figure out the angle of the sun and the horizon and know where you are. Because depending on what time of day it is, the sun is going to be somewhere else in the sky. And depending on where you are on Earth, the sun is going to be somewhere in the sky. We know that by observing our shadows. So the sextant helps figure out where you are, and the compass tells you where you're going. Draw a map and you're done. The Portuguese developed a ship called a caravel. It was originally supposed to be a cargo ship with a large carrying capacity, and they found out, once again by accident, hey, this ship can survive a storm. Cool, I'm not dead. So they started mass producing these. They also started fitting them with lateen sails. Lateen sails are Arab design. And the lateen sail helps ships move faster and make them more maneuverable. All right. Any questions about this so far? Make sense? Not yet? Okay, so let's talk about why Spain and Portugal were the first ones to begin exploring the world. Because those of you who may remember this, the first people to begin reaching out and interacting with parts of the world were the Spanish and Portuguese. Not the English, not the French, not the Italians. Well, definitely not the Italians, because they already owned the trade routes. Okay. This is a map of the gradual reconquest of Italy. Of the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, also known as the Reconquista. In 718, the Second Caliphate, the Umayyad Caliphate, jumped across the Mediterranean from North Africa and into what is now Spain and Portugal. And they conquered almost the entirety of the Iberian Peninsula, and then pushed even further to invade Spain, where they were defeated by Charlemagne's grandfather, Charles Martel. A guy so cool, his nickname is the Hammer. That's pretty dope if people call you Charles the Hammer Martel. The conquest of Spain was almost in its entirety. Spain was almost completely conquered except for this little red strip up here. That's the kingdom of Asturias. It's a mountain-based kingdom. And the only reason the Islamic armies were not able to conquer this is because it's high up in the mountains and horses don't do too well in the mountains. So the Asturians were able to maintain their own kingdom by mountain fighting and keeping the Muslims out. But the Iberian Peninsula remained under Muslim control for about 700 years. And the Iberian Catholics began fighting a series of long, grinding, very bloody wars against the Muslim occupiers to try to push the Muslims out of the peninsula. And each color represents another wave of the Reconquista. So Asturias started breaking away kingdoms like Leon, for example. And then they pushed the Muslims out a little bit further, then a little bit further, then a little bit further. But this went on for 700 years. And these wars were nasty, really bloody wars. But by 1400, the Kingdom of Portugal, which is from here down, Portugal had emerged as an independent kingdom. They had solidified their borders, and they had achieved peace. And it was the Portuguese that began international exploration. And here's why. One of the things that every army tries to do during a time of war is to cut off their enemy from their enemy's supply lines. And the Muslim, what the Spanish called the Moors, operating in the Iberian Peninsula, were getting resupplied from North Africa. So the Spanish and Portuguese armies would occasionally launch expeditions into North Africa to cut off the supply lines to the Moors in Spain. And the Portuguese launched one kind of attack and attacked a city, a North African city called Quetta, which I believe Spain actually still has control over, if I remember correctly. And Quetta was attached to the trade route of the West African gold and salt trade. Now, it was a small city. It was not particularly wealthy. It was nowhere near as wealthy as cities like Timbuktu. But to the Portuguese, who were a very poor kingdom, it may as well have been El Dorado. We're talking the city of gold for them. They get into Quetta, they're like, oh my God, this place is loaded. And the people living in Quetta are like, you ain't seen nothing yet, buddy. So the Portuguese first reaction is, okay, this city is super wealthy. Where do we get more? And the people living in Quetta, it's like, dude, there's like just a couple 100 miles south in West Africa. There's like all these kingdoms that make all this gold and salt. And the Portuguese are like, did you just say gold? Jump on their ships, and they started going south. So the Portuguese began launching these expeditions to establish trade depots all up and down the West African coast. They also took over the Canary and the Madeira Islands. When they landed in the Madeira and Canary Islands, they also discovered something that was worth a lot of money to them. They found sugarcane. Now keep in mind, this is still a period of time where the delicacy of the day would be boiled salted pork. So if you find an island that's coated in sugarcane, and you bite into sugarcane, you're like, ah, it's like the heavens open and the angels start singing. And then you can sell it. Holy shit, we just found a gold mine. But then you gotta grow it, and you gotta dig it up. Oh, that's hard work. I don't want to do that. So the Portuguese are like, oh God, all right, how are we gonna harvest the sugarcane from our islands? Well, the trade among West Africa kind of helped facilitate that, because merchants began establishing trade routes along the West African coastlines, and they began doing business a lot with a lot of the kingdoms in West Africa. And while they were there, they were exposed to the West African slave network. So the Portuguese would land in West Africa, and they'd be like, "Oh yeah, let's do some business. Yeah, I want to get some gold and a couple of things. Hey, who are those fellows, and why do you have them in chains?" And the West Africans would be like, "Oh, they're our slaves. They do work for us." The Portuguese would be like, "Do you have to pay them?" And the West Africans would be like, "No, they're our slaves. They're our rivals. We enslave them, we capture them from rival tribes, and we put them to work." And the Portuguese would be like, "Work for free. How much?" So the Portuguese began trading firearms for slaves with West African kingdoms. And then the West African kingdoms would use the firearms to attack their rivals to get more slaves to sell to the Portuguese for more guns. Rinse and repeat. Now the Portuguese then began playing all sides against each other. So one tribe would get guns and then start attacking their rivals, and then the rivals would come to the Portuguese, "We need guns," and the Portuguese were all too happy to give them guns. And the Portuguese began sending slaves to the Canary and the Madeira Islands to harvest sugar, which the Portuguese would then sell to the rest of Europe. It actually got so bad that one of the kings in West Africa wrote a letter to the king of Portugal saying, "Please stop buying slaves. Our population is crashing." It was really bad. In 1488, Bartolomeu Diaz, he was sailing to one of the more southern trade depots set up by the Portuguese, got caught in a storm, and when the storm ended, he was on the other side of the southern tip of Africa, and he was in the Indian Ocean. And his first reaction was probably like, "Holy shit, I'm not dead. Oh my God, where am I? I'm going to get eaten by a monster." And he went back to Portugal. But the Portuguese discovered by accident that yes, you can actually go around Africa. And that opened the floodgates, because then Vasco da Gama purposely went around Africa and began setting up trade depots in Mozambique, Mombasa, and eventually in India. I think he even made it to China. The Portuguese also landed in Indonesia, an area so full of spices that the Europeans called them the Spice Islands. All right, so what about the Spanish? When did they start taking off? Well, the Spanish began their exploration after they were finished with the Reconquista. The Reconquista for Spain did not end until 1492. And Spain had coalesced into two major kingdoms and one kind of minor one. The Kingdom of Navarre was actually a puppet to France. But you have the Kingdom of Aragon and the Kingdom of Castile. Aragon is a very wealthy place. There's a lot of silver mines, so there was a lot of silver mines in that area. Castile, for example, Castilian areas had very large manpower, but they were more of an agrarian society. These two kingdoms coalesced into modern Spain when, if I remember correctly, it was Ferdinand and Isabella. Isabella of the Kingdom of Castile married Ferdinand in the Kingdom of Aragon. And when those two married, the two kingdoms joined into modern Spain. So by the way, the Catalonian independence movement, which is still today, is related to this. Because there are some Spanish that think that the Kingdom of Aragon should be an independent state. But Spain was united with the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella, and Ferdinand then launched a final campaign against the final Muslim stronghold in southern Spain, which he destroyed in 1492, and then the Spanish Inquisition began. Spanish Inquisition was church officials went into Spain and began purging Spain of non-Catholics. Jews and Muslims were targeted. Now, the common belief about the Inquisition was that it was indiscriminate slaughter. That is actually not the case. The Inquisition was incredibly thorough and more akin to trials. So people were put on trial, records were meticulously kept, and there were certain punishments for certain infractions. Really what the church was doing was trying to ensure doctrinal purity within Spain. Now that did not mean that there wasn't a whole lot of suffering. The Inquisition wrote the book on how to torture people. And a lot of people ended up being tortured to death during the Inquisition because they were not pure Catholic, I guess you could say. And the Jews and the Muslims were all expelled from Spain. But the Spanish finally emerged, and for Spain, this war, the Reconquista, had gone on for about 770 years. Now imagine how you would feel if you were part of a society that had been fighting a war for 700 years. That's so old you wouldn't even know your own ancestors that fought in it when it first began. You wouldn't even know their names. I mean, we're talking 700 years, that's 14 generations? No, that's more than that. That's a hell of a lot of generations. Right? So the Spanish, after finally finishing the Reconquista, I guess you could say it kind of went to their heads. But then again, you don't magically win a war of 700 years and not think that somehow God was playing a hand in this. So the Spanish, after the end of the Reconquista, came to believe that they were God's chosen people and that it was their duty to glorify God, to honor their victory. So they vowed to glorify God by spreading Christianity to all corners of the world. You can see where this is going. All right, we will actually end here. Does anybody have any questions about what we've gone over today?